30 guests laughed as my brother-in-law emptied an entire glass of red wine over my head. He screamed at me to get out of his sight. I almost turned and walked away, until the hotel manager came sprinting across the ballroom, pushed past 2 waiters, bowed low in front of everyone, and asked one question that stopped the music completely. "Madam President, should we cancel the entire event right now? My name is Aubrey." That night was the night my husband, his mother, and his brother finally learned who they had been humiliating for 5 years. I need to take you back before the wine, before the bow, before any of it made sense to the people standing in that room. I married into the Whitfield family 5 years ago, and from the very first dinner, Diane, the mother of my husband Grant, decided I was not enough. She ran a modest real estate office and judged the world by job titles and bank balances, and by that measure I had failed her before I even sat down. I worked as an ordinary project coordinator, and to Diane that made me a burden her son was foolish enough to marry. The comments came quiet at first, wrapped in smiles, aimed at my clothes, my job, my silence at the dinner table. Then there was Bryce. The younger brother, the golden son Diane, built her entire pride around. When Bryce landed a director role at a logistics firm downtown, Diane treated it like a coronation. Every family dinner became a stage built for him while I refilled water glasses at the far end of the table, invisible unless someone needed something passed along. Grant noticed sometimes. He would glance at me, open his mouth, start to say something, and then his mother would raise her voice half a decibel higher, and whatever he was about to say died quietly in his throat. 5 years of that taught me it was easier to disappear than to keep losing the same argument. The night everything broke was Bryce turning 30, celebrated in a ballroom dripping with gold light, a live band, and enough imported wine to fill a small lake. I stood near the back most of the evening, the way I always did at Whitfield events, until Bryce climbed onto a small platform near the band, glass raised, thanking every single person in that room for helping him become the man he was tonight. Every person except me. When he stepped down and spotted me by the dessert table, something ugly crossed his face. He said it was time the family embarrassment learned her place, and before I could take a single step back, he tipped his glass and poured the entire thing over my head. The room went silent for exactly 1 heartbeat before it erupted into laughter. "Someone should throw her out," Bryce said, wiping his hand on his jacket like I had dirtied him just by existing. "She came dressed above her own class," he added, loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear, and then he waved toward the door and called for security like I was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. I stood there with wine running down my collarbone, ruining a dress I had saved 3 months to buy, and I did not cry. I picked up a linen napkin from the nearest table, pressed it slowly against my hair, and looked directly at Bryce with a calm that clearly unsettled him more than tears ever could have. "I hope that made you feel important," I said, "and nothing else." Grant stood frozen a few feet away the entire time. I watched him look at me, then look at his mother, his jaw working like he wanted to say something, needed to say something. And Diane placed one hand flat against his chest without even glancing at him, a silent order to stay exactly where he was. He obeyed her, the way he always did, and something in me finished breaking in that exact second, quieter than the glass had shattered, but final all the same. I reached into my clutch and dialed a number I had not used in almost 2 years. "Walter," I said the moment he picked up, "freeze every payment tied to tonight." Nothing more. No explanation. I hung up before Bryce could even finish laughing at whatever joke he was making to the guests still filming on their phones. Less than 4 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened and the venue manager came half running across the marble floor, cutting straight through a cluster of stunned guests, and stopped in front of me. He bowed low enough that his forehead nearly reached his knees. "Madam President," he said, his voice shaking, "should we cancel the entire event right now?" The band stopped playing mid-song. Every conversation in that ballroom died at once. Diane stood frozen with her hand still hovering near her son's chest. And Bryce, glass still dripping from his fingers, stared at the manager like the man had just spoken a different language. Nobody in that room, including my own husband, understood what they had just heard, and I let the silence stretch for a long moment before I answered. "No," I told the manager, "let it continue. I am simply leaving early." I turned and walked out through a hallway lined with photographers hired for the party, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly had far more questions than answers. For the next several days, I said almost nothing. Grant called constantly, sending messages asking who Walter was, why a hotel manager had bowed to me, why my name had suddenly started appearing in whispered phone calls he was not part of. I let him wonder. I let all of them wonder because for 2 years I had let them believe I was ordinary, and I wanted them to sit inside that same uncertainty for a while before I gave it back. The truth finally came out 6 days later, when I asked Grant, Diane, and Bryce to meet me at a private office downtown. They arrived expecting an apology from me, judging by the smug set of Bryce's jaw. Instead, they found themselves sitting across a glass desk from Walter Doyle, the interim chief executive of Kensington Global, the company my late father built and left entirely in my name. I am the chairwoman, I told them plainly. I have been the chairwoman this entire time. The venue you celebrated in belongs to a hospitality division my company quietly owns. The account that paid for every glass of wine poured that night was mine. The color drained from every face in that room. The hand of Diane trembled around the strap of her purse. Grant looked at me like he was seeing a stranger wearing his wife's face. Bryce simply stopped breathing for a second, the reality of who he had humiliated finally landing. What followed was not quick, and it was not quiet. Within a week, footage from that ballroom, filmed by someone's phone that night, found its way online, and it spread fast, because nothing travels quite like a grown man pouring wine over a woman while calling security on her. Bryce's employer received calls from journalists asking questions the company had no good answers for, and by the end of the month, he no longer had a desk to sit at. The real estate office run by Diane lost 2 major referral partners almost overnight, both of whom quietly admitted they had only ever done business with her because of a family connection to Kensington Global that no longer existed. Clients who once fought for a meeting with her now returned her calls a week late, if at all. Grant tried the hardest to hold on. He showed up at my building 3 separate times, and each time he said some version of the same thing, that he never meant to stay silent, that his mother had controlled him his whole life, that he was sorry, that he still loved me. Diane called once, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it, asking if there was any way to undo what had spread across the internet, begging me to remember the family we had once pretended to be. Bryce sent one message, short and stiff, admitting he had been cruel and asking if I could speak to the press on his behalf. I answered none of them the way they wanted. I filed for divorce, closed the account that had quietly funded half of Diane's business connections for years, and let each of them face the consequences of a night they had built entirely on their own. A year passed. I rebuilt quietly, the way I always had, except this time I did not hide who I was. Then, almost exactly 1 year to the day, Kensington Global hosted a charity gala in that same ballroom. The same marble floor, the same gold lighting, this time filled with board members, partners, and press instead of a birthday crowd. I walked in wearing a deep red dress, and the same venue manager who had bowed to me that first night stepped forward, announced my arrival to the entire room, and the guests rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted nearly a full minute. I stood there for a moment, letting it settle, remembering exactly where I had been standing the last time I walked through those doors. The last time I entered this ballroom, I left covered in wine. Tonight, I left surrounded by applause.